So last video I made, I talked about this really awful book, The 4-Hour Workweek, which is like awful advice if you actually want to try to discover your passion and define your calling, things like that. This video I want to talk about another book called The Body Keeps the Score by this really famous psychologist, Bessel Kolk. He's unlike Tim Ferriss, the author of The 4-Hour Workweek. This guy is a real professional, internationally respected, many decades in his field. And the book is subtitled Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. So the book specifically is about how trauma can affect our minds and particularly what's going on in our subconscious, and as a result can affect what's going on in our bodies. The idea of, or the meaning of the body keeps the score is that the things that we feel in our subconscious, particularly with respect to truly traumatic incidents, get embedded physiologically. They get embedded into our bodies. In our body we have physical responses that not only occur at the time of trauma, but then also throughout time as these trauma memories are triggered. I don't want to talk about the focus on trauma, because that's not really what the purpose of this channel is. I want to talk about this because it's really interesting from a subconscious and a conscious perspective of how that relates to discovering your passion, finding your calling, and that sort of thing. So I just made a list of, I would just want to talk about some passages that I read that I think are good sort of launching points for me to discuss how this relates to the general topic. I can't read without my taking these things off. This is what happens when you're 47. All right, so there's one passage when one of he refers to his great teacher, this guy, Elvin Semrad, who tells him the greatest sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. And it's really interesting. I don't know if I talked about this in a prior video, or I know I wrote about it in my Substack channel. The fact that our subconscious minds take in a vast amount of information, like every second of the day. But most of this information we're not consciously aware of. The subconscious mind sort of does like a pre-filtering and a pre-processing on this information, and it assembles the information into what a lot of people call a story, a coherent narrative for us to understand the world, given that there's just this enormous volume of data, sensory information that bombards our brain all the time. So the subconscious sort of pre-filters that and creates a story to help us understand the world. Now, one of the problems is that the subconscious is not like an objective observer of the world. It's biased, and it's biased in favor of who we would like to think we are. So what happens over time is we keep reinforcing a story that we tell ourselves where we're like the hero of our own life story, and we want the hero ourselves to always be portrayed in the best possible light. Always right about everything. If there's ever a controversy, the hero, is in the right, and it's somebody else who is victimizing us or is in the wrong in some way. So when his teacher says it's the lies we tell ourselves, it's not necessarily deliberate lies that we tell ourselves. It's these lies that the subconscious mind relays to our conscious minds that are biased, particularly in our favor. And it often shows up subconsciously or consciously disregarding information that disagrees with beliefs that we hold as sort of part of our sense of identity, related to our ego, our sense of selves, things that we hold so dear that we wouldn't want to change these particular views because they might call into question the image that we have of ourselves. And this image we hold on to like for dear life because it defines who we are. And without a sense of identity, it's hard to imagine like what a human what a just an everyday non-traumatized human would be like without a sense of identity. And this identity comes from all of our past experiences as well as how we process information in real time. So it's a combination of everything up to and including the present. So when he talks about the lies we tell ourselves, it's very interesting to think about it in terms of these are not necessarily deliberate lies. These are lies our subconscious tells our conscious minds to make us look as good as possible. I'll talk a little bit more about that as it relates to discovering your passion in a little bit. All right, 17. What do we do? Okay. All right, so this is interesting. And I'm going to be doing like a lot of reading these passages, like multiple sentences, because this is really good stuff and it's not something I can just like summarize. So I really have to just kind of take my eyes off the camera and actually read this. Another passage, imagination is absolutely critical to the quality of our lives. Our imagination enables us to leave our routine everyday existence by fantasizing about all these other things, all the things that make life interesting. It gives us the opportunity to envision new possibilities. It's an essential launch pad for making our hopes come true. When people are compulsively and constantly pulled back into the past to the last time they felt intense involvement and deep emotions, they suffer from a failure of imagination, a loss of the mental flexibility. Without imagination, there is no hope, no chance to envision a better future, no place to go, no goal to reach. All right, so I think this is really interesting because I think it's common for people to escape into, you could say imagination in a broad sense, but escape into entertainment and fantasy, not necessarily fantasy in terms of like science fiction or anything like that, but fantasy in terms of, social media and, using your imagination to picture a better life for yourself, one that you aren't necessarily on any path to obtain, however you define a better life. A lot of people I recognize identify a better life as, Insta-worthy lives. You go on Instagram, all these like beautiful people having beautiful lives, right? I mean, that's like what most people want. I mean, one can understand this goal, right? But, we have this powerful thing called imagination, and too often we use it as an escape, okay? Instead of using it as a way to plot a path forward. And for me, this relates to discovering one's passion, because certainly from my own experience after having discovered my passion last year, which is reading and writing, I found that it's like now that I have this path forward, this thing that I have fallen in love with, I use my imagination in order to help me plot a path forward for how I can follow this path, for ideally the rest of my life, and how I can translate this passion into a calling, which is this like driving passion, this driving force that you do, that not only helps you live and feel like live a more fulfilling life and feel more fulfilled, but do something meaningful and beneficial for society. And so it's like, instead of using imagination, as an escape, as like an aid for fantasizing what some glorious future might be like that you don't necessarily have any path towards, I found once you discover your passion and ideally find a calling, but certainly once you discover your passion, you're like, oh, this is like the start of the path forward, then your imagination can go into overdrive thinking about how you can implement this for your benefit, for a fulfilling life, as well as for the benefit of everybody else. Because like generally when you discover your passion, it's something, from my experience, when you discover your passion and define a calling from this passion, it's something that you want to do that is like meaningfully beneficial to society. So it's just interesting, this concept of, imaginations and how we can either use it for a not necessarily constructive purpose, which is just escapism, or if you have this exact focus, your imagination then becomes like your partner. It becomes an aid, a very valuable tool to help push you along this path, where you might not necessarily know, 2 or 3 or 4 steps, from now what you're going to do along this path, or, how the path is going to go, but you can use your imagination to help find the best course. Anyway, I found that very interesting. 26. What are we doing? Okay, so actually his same teacher, he said, this guy Semrad taught us that most human suffering is related to love and loss, and that the job of therapists is to help people acknowledge, experience, and bear, that was a quote, the reality of life with all its pleasures and heartbreak. Again, he says the sources of our suffering are the lies we tell ourselves. And he'd say, urging us to be honest with ourselves about every facet of our experience. He often said that people can never get better without knowing what they know and feeling what they feel. So I know I've mentioned before, I think it was in the last video, and certainly in my Substack articles, the power of writing down, like writing down our thoughts, even if it's not directed writing, just like writing down sort of how you feel and what you're thinking about, and then using that as a starting point to further write and see where that goes. There's a book, I know I mentioned this in the last video, it's called The Power of Writing It Down. I think it was Alison Fallon, I think is the author, and I'll be doing a video on her book, definitely coming up. But, with regards to this idea of the lies that we tell ourselves and the way to escape, the suffering that comes along with lying to ourselves, certainly about the way the world actually is and our actual true place in the world and who we actually are. The way to escape that is, he's saying to be absolutely honest about like how the world really is and who you really are and really what is your place in the world and what really is going on inside your mind and how really do you feel about who you are and how things are in the world. And I found that an excellent way to do that is through writing. And it's not like you have to sit down and from the start you're like, oh, I'm going to write this like great masterpiece with my amazing thoughts and my great wisdom about the world. It doesn't really work that way. What I found for myself is that I just sit down, and I think I mentioned before, I write for 2 hours every day, just undistracted writing. There's no, it's not even writing, it's not like writing an outline for these talks or anything like that. It's just writing about things that I've been thinking about and how they relate to things that I've been reading. And I found that it's really amazing and beneficial that when I'm writing, I think of these things that I wouldn't necessarily think of if I were just thinking of them. It's just like going for a walk and thinking of these things, in my head. It's like the act of writing it down helps me go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3. It helps me to like piece together my thoughts into something constructive, as opposed to if I were just going for a walk and just thinking, it would be more like, almost like, not necessarily as undirected as a stream of consciousness, but definitely not nearly as directed. And I mean, it's amazing, maybe because I write from like 4 in the morning to 6 in the morning, but a lot of times, like the next day or even later that day, I forget what I wrote about, and maybe because I was just tired. But then I go back and read it, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm surprised I even came up with that. That's pretty good. And it's like if I hadn't written it down, like that would have been lost. I would have had to come up with that the next day. So, this idea of being truthful with yourself, I found a very useful method of, or a strategy or tool to be able to do that is through writing your thoughts down, writing your feelings down. And, as I recommended in the last video, if you don't have the habit of doing that every day, I recommend start super easy, just 5 minutes a day of writing. And then, over time, build up as you develop the habit. The other day I finished Atomic Habits by James Clear, I think. And I mentioned that in the last video. It's a good book, and I'll talk about habit formation and things like this. But that's definitely one thing I recommend, not just for the purpose of getting a handle on your thoughts and your feelings, but for for the purpose of being honest with yourself about what's really going on inside. Okay, enough talking about that. I think I just did 26. Yeah, so we got to go to 58. All right. Okay, so this is interesting. It's talking about mirror neurons, which, maybe it's a concept, maybe they think it's, actual thing, but it's the part of the brain that allows us to empathize with other people. So like mirror their emotions, that's where they get the term. Numerous experiments were followed around the world. It soon became clear that mirror neurons explain many previously unexplainable aspects of the mind, such as empathy, imitation, synchrony, even the development of language, because we learn language, when we're very young, certainly, our primary language, by imitating other people, right? So it's this whole idea of like, imitation, empathy, synchronizing with other people in whatever way. Okay, but it says, this is very interesting. Our mirror neurons not only help us by synchronizing and empathizing with other people because we're social animals. So certainly when we're very young, we have to learn how to get along in a group. And we do this by observing other people, how other people interact in a group, and then observing other people's responses to how we act, as well as learning language and a lot of other things. But it says our mirror neurons also make us vulnerable to others' negativity, so that we respond to their anger with fury or are dragged down by their depression. All right, that's fine. So it's like these mirror neurons, this part of our brain that helps us, or that is part of our being social animals, right, can both help and hurt us. It helps us when we learn how to get along in what people call our tribe, right? But it can hurt us when we assume certainly like negative emotions of other people. And this is absolutely true that I found in like social media and media in general. It's like, what type of media gets the most visceral, strongest, longest lasting engagement, right? It's typically the ones that excite our emotion, one, that excite our emotions, but two, excite our emotions in a negative sense. Like if something gets you really, really pissed off and you're super angry about it, you're more likely to be more engaged than if something makes you super happy. Now, this is just my general impression. I'm not citing any sources or anything, but this is just, based on my experience and my impression from what, things that I've read. And so, another thing that I talked about as like another one of these building block tools for discovering one's passion is the idea of reading, and in particular, reading avidly, widely, and thoughtfully. It's this expression that I use. And I know for me, right at the beginning of COVID, there were a lot of things going on in my life that I just had to step away from, a lot of negative things, like professionally, personally, whatever. And it's like, maybe my mirror neurons were like, off the scale, with their sort of mirroring their negativity, and I just had to step away. And fortunately, COVID, fortunately or unfortunately, unfortunately for the world, but silver lining in my particular case, COVID hit and everything kind of shut down. So it was like a perfect way for me to step away from all these negative influences. And that's when I began reading. Reading like a lot. And it was really amazing because the things that I was reading, they weren't negative things. Most of it was like great literature. And so the way I view it was like a very healthy influence. Like for all my mirror neurons, it's like when you're reading, I'm sure that, you empathize with the characters and you get engaged in a way as if, it was like you were observing two people in real life talking or whatever. And so I think, this concept of the mirror neurons, for me, really makes a lot of sense because during that period, and frankly, like for most of the last 3 years, I've spent so much of my time reading, and reading like good, healthy things that expand my perspective, expand my understanding of the world, give me a better insight into, myself and how the mind works and, things like this, that it's like I've practically divorced myself from most of the negativity in the world by just focusing my reading on things that I regard as quite healthy. So it's like we can put ourselves in a position where these mirror neurons can either help us or hurt us. And two ways that I think, or one particular way that I think you can make a daily habit of having your mirror neurons help you is by reading, in particular reading avidly, widely, and thoughtfully. And I talked about this the last thing, and if you're not a big reader, again, just like the writing, I recommend start 5 minutes a day, build the habit, and I think you'll find over time you want to do more and more reading, because I found it's incredibly healthy. It's not just about like putting facts into my brain. In fact, that's like number 5 on the list of the reasons I read. But one of the most important things is just so psychologically healthy for my mind, like my conscious analytical mind, as well as my emotional health is really, really good. Okay, 80. I know you're not really supposed to like look down and look away from the camera, but I can't help it. And again, it's a technical book, right? And I recommend you read it if you have time. I'll get into that later. But this is not something that I can just, here's a quick 3-second summary of what's going on. It's like I actually have to read this stuff. All right, so our culture teaches us to focus on personal uniqueness, but at a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Our brains are built to help us function as members of a tribe. We are part of that tribe even when we are by ourselves, whether listening to music, watching a baseball game on TV, or preparing a spreadsheet for a sales meeting. Most of our energy is devoted to connecting with others. So, it's interesting. It's like these mirror neurons connected with this idea of, yes, we are social creatures by our very nature. And apparently most of our consciousness, or maybe most of our subconscious mind, is focused on how do we exist in the world with other people. Which means, even though in our subconscious minds and also in our conscious minds, we are the hero, the center of our lives, we're the hero of our life story. It's still within the context of how do we exist in this world? How do we get from this world and out of this world what we want? How do we work with other people to get what we want? Hopefully you get to a point where you're like, how do I work with other people to help them get what they want? But certainly by our very nature, we are self-interested creatures. It's like you have to worry about your own survival first, right? And so it's like, so much of our consciousness is focused on the exterior that we spend, even though we are the center of our own lives, it seems like we spend little of our time really understanding not necessarily who we are, but who our minds tell us we are. And I think we don't spend enough time questioning that story. I read this fascinating book. I'll probably do 2 or 3 videos on this in the coming weeks. It's called The Science of Storytelling. Just finished it last night. Really, really amazing. And it talked about how, much of the, who we tell ourselves that we are, who we would like to think we are, comes during the first 20 years of our lives, when our minds are most impressionable and we're still understanding who we are and our place in the world and forming this story about who we are. And I think for most people, they stick with that story for most of their lives. And, it's very interesting when you have this image of yourself and you have this image of, how you can operate in the world in order to get what you want. Well, when you come in conflict with something external, other people, things in the world in general, that push back against this image that you have of yourself, I think it's natural to lash out against the world, lash out against other people, blame the world, and say everybody else is wrong. I'm right. This image that I have of myself is the right image to have, and I'm the good guy, and blah, blah, blah. And I think most people don't spend enough time really questioning that. And I think it's only in certain circumstances in life, and not necessarily in all lives, certainly not in all lives, when people have to come face to face in a pretty difficult and psychologically trying manner. They have to come face to face with who they think they are, who they have told themselves that they are, and who the world actually thinks they are. And this is the stuff of Shakespearean plays and operas and and everything else. Great fiction, as well as this is played out on the world stage every day. And so I think in terms of certainly a book on psychology, and then just reading in general and writing down your thoughts and trying to understand your feelings, I think there's a tremendous value in doing that, because it helps put you in touch with who you really are, or at least helps block out some of the noise so that you can hopefully have a chance of hearing, sort of like this whisper of, oh, this is who I really am, not this story that my chatterbox subconscious mind is telling me every second of every day. It's like this filter that it's interpreting the world in terms of, the image that we have of ourselves, and not in terms of like who we actually are. Anyway, it's very interesting. I might talk about that more later in the video. 97. This could be like a 2-hour video. I don't want to get too crazy. Okay, so this talks about this concept of agency, which is feeling as though you're not necessarily that you're in control, total control of your life, but that you have the power to change important and fundamental things in your life in order to direct the path that you want to take at any given time. So he says, agency is a technical term for feeling of being in charge of your life, knowing where you stand, knowing that you have a say in what happens to you, knowing that you have some ability to shape your circumstances. And okay, and so it's like, oh, so this is really interesting, this concept of agency and feeling in control. I think, this is my conjecture, I'll say, I think that the vast majority of people deep down don't feel that they have significant agency in their lives, particularly in their professional lives, the directions of their lives. I'm not talking necessarily about your immediate family and you have a nice family life or whatever, but more in terms of how they fit in with the world, right? Their place in the world. I think, I read, I don't know if I quoted this in a previous video or not, this was in Angela Duckworth's Grit, where it's only 13% or something of the US population truly feels engaged at work. So they're kind of checked out. They're not engaged, but they still have to go every day because they have bills to pay. Well, that's a fundamental recipe for, a feeling of a lack of agency, right? And honestly, this is the motive behind Tim Ferriss's idiotic 4-Hour Workweek book, where, he says, look, I recognize you hate your jobs. So, the solution is just try to work at your jobs 4 hours a week. Well, and then you can have this amazing lifestyle and blah, blah, blah. I guess it worked for Tim Ferriss. I don't know about anybody else who read the book. But, from my perspective, it's well, that's not really, yes, if you win the lottery, you can exercise a huge amount of control over your life, and you don't have to, change as a person, even though you can fundamentally change your circumstances, you can have this amazing lifestyle, or what Tim says in his book, if you manage to fool your bosses and scam your employer, and you're only working from home 4 hours a week and you're off, on vacation the rest of the time. It's like, okay, that's one way to try to get agency in your life where you feel in control. So even though you're working at a job you don't particularly like, well, you've managed to like game the system and take advantage of the rules in order to get ahead. Well, I mean, from my perspective, that's not true agency. Like, true agency is being absolutely engaged in what you're doing, truly being fulfilled, with what you're doing, and feeling as though you're making a valuable and meaningful and important contribution to society, so that you feel good not only about who you are, but your place in the world and how you interact with other people. And this absolutely goes to the concept of discovering your passion, because I found when I discovered my passion at age 47, it was completely unlike any feeling that I had before, and absolutely in terms of a feeling of agency. Now, when I discovered my passion, I described this in one of my first videos. I'd been reading for just over 2 years, and I was reading Gogol's Dead Souls, and all of a sudden it hit me. It was like I just fell in love with reading and writing. Okay, well, yes, that for me, that provided a sense of agency, because it was like, oh, now I have this amazing fire. And it was like right away I knew it. And I was like, now I have this amazing fire inside of me that gives me a direction that I didn't have before. But just being in love with reading and writing is in a specific direction. So then I spent the next 9 months, trying to determine what the specific direction is. But nevertheless, just discovering my passion gave me this powerful sense of agency, where it was like, oh, this is the general direction that I need to go. I don't know specifically where, but it's like, this is the general direction, and I feel such motivation, the likes of which I've not felt ever before for anything. It was incredible. So, for me, the solution for people, and I think this is the overwhelming vast majority of the world's population who don't truly have a sense of agency, like a meaningful sense of agency in their lives. And again, in particular, I mean your external lives, external to your family life, your professional life, and how you fit in with the rest of the world and society in general. I think that I would call it a solution, except it's not like you can just like go out and buy this, or do a 2-step, like a 10-step program and find it. But discovering one's passion, I found for me, is one of the most effective ways one can have this sense of agency in one's life. And that's what this channel is dedicated to. I mean, this is all new for me, and I'm trying to develop an understanding of how people work, and how we fit in society, and how society has an effect on us, in order to develop tools and strategies that I can share with all of you to help you discover your passion. I'm not there yet, and so it's like these videos, it's like I'm just talking about books that I've read, and I'm going jabbering. But still, this whole process is, everything is focused on helping other people, giving them tool strategies that they could find their own passion, and as a result for themselves, they could have this amazing feeling of agency in their own lives. 110. I mean, it's funny, I'm just like looking at the camera. It's no problem if the camera's fuzzy, but I feel like I'm not actually engaged with you unless it's clear. So I put my glasses back on. Anyway, 110. Okay, this is good. And this talks about children who did or did not suffer traumatic experiences in their lives. So obviously, children as children. Despite their alertness to trouble, the children who had not been abused still trusted an essentially benign universe. They could imagine ways out of bad situations. The responses of the clinic children were alarming. And when he says clinic children, these were children who did suffer some form of abuse early on, and so they were in these psychiatric clinics and or psychological clinics to study them. It said for these children who did suffer abuse, the most innocent images stirred up intense feelings of danger, aggression, sexual arousal, and terror. These images were not selected because they had some hidden meaning that sensitive people could uncover. They were ordinary images of everyday life. We could only conclude that for abused children, the whole world is filled with triggers. As long as they can imagine only disastrous outcomes to relatively benign situations, anybody walking into a room, any stranger, any image on a screen or on a billboard might be perceived as a harbinger of catastrophe. So it's very interesting because we're talking about two different sets of children with two different life experiences that affect how they view the world. So this is purely psychological. Now you could say this is the body keeps a score, so you could say it's psychological and physical because some of the trauma is embedded physically as well as psychologically. But in particular, it's how they view the world. Do they have a positive, benign view of the world, or do they have a negative, malignant view of the world? Like a view of the world that there's danger everywhere. And again, for me, this speaks to the power of reading and writing, particularly reading avidly, widely, and thoughtfully. And I keep using this phrase because it's important, because there are three components, and 2 out of 3 doesn't necessarily cut it. But it's like, I have found the more that I read, and the more I read of the right things, the wider and wider perspective I have on the world, the better understanding I have of myself, the greater the depth of my knowledge I have of all of these things. And so it helps me understand the world as it is, and it helps me understand myself as I am. Because, for these children, you could look at like two different extremes. You could say, oh, they believe the world is a totally safe place, or the other group believes the world is a completely dangerous place. And in reality, neither's true, right? There is a whole lot of bad stuff going on in the world. And so if you have a benign view of the world, I think your perspective is a little narrow. But there's also a lot that's good in the world. There are a lot of really good people doing, behaving well, and being useful members of their communities, of their societies, of their global community. So not everything is negative and malignant. And I found reading extensively helps to create a realistic view so that you're not at one extreme or the other. And this goes back to, the beginning, the first thing I talked about, which is like the lies we tell ourselves. And there's great power in expanding your perspective and getting a much better understanding of how the world actually is. Because when you can see reality as it is, we can understand what is true and what is not true. It's really, really powerful in terms of being able to interact with the world, being able to understand yourself in a way that you can't, I think, in a healthy manner, if you don't have a realistic view of how the world is. So anyway, 169. Okay, so it says our great challenge, and this is the challenge. He's either a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I think maybe he's both. But anyway, when he says our great challenge, he's probably specifically referring to psychiatrists and psychologists, but then maybe like the world in general. Our great challenge is to apply the lessons of neuroplasticity, meaning your mind can. It can change itself. It can rewire itself based on new information. I guess consistent exposure to new information. So apply the lessons of neuroplasticity, the flexibility of brain circuits, to rewire the brains and reorganize the minds of people who have been programmed by life itself to experience others as threats and themselves as helpless. Now, he's speaking specifically, again, this is the book on the healing of trauma, so he's speaking specifically to people who have been greatly fundamentally affected by traumatic experiences in their lives. But my focus is on, the idea of, neuroplasticity, flexibility in our brain circuits, rewiring our brains to change how we perceive ourselves and the world. Again, this all goes back to the power of reading and writing, which is why for this video and like the next 20, I'm going to be talking about books that I've read. It's just so powerful. Oh, because it's like, most of us have what I call psychological muscle memory. All right, you know what muscle memory is, right? So psychological, you keep thinking the same things in the same ways, and you think about yourself in the same way, and you think about the world, in the same way. Unless something drastic happens, like you win the lottery, you're not going to have, greatly different results. And if you don't have this feeling of agency, if you don't have a feeling of fulfillment, if you don't feel like, you're following your passion, like you're using, your skills in the best way, you're, living the life that you would like. I'm not talking about like, living like a billionaire and whatever. I'm talking about like a truly meaningful life. If you don't think differently, things probably are not going to change. And I found one of the absolutely most effective and best ways to change how you think is to change the inputs to your mind. And the best way to do that, I found, I believe, certainly for myself, is reading. I mean, there's nothing, I think, that's more powerful in terms of being able to rewire your mind, change how you think, change your perspective, than reading avidly, widely, and thoughtfully. I know I'm a broken record, but it's that important. 183. Okay, so this speaks to, so he's talking about Sigmund Freud, which everybody's at least heard of, and then Freud's, I don't know if his Freud's mentor or his mentor, Joseph Breuer. They talked about each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked. And when the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail, okay? And they said, they said recollection without affect, without like bringing up this like emotional response, almost invariably produces no result. It's this idea of describing in the greatest possible detail what's going on deep inside. And again, this speaks to the power of writing. And it said, it was like, one way, they explain that unless there's an energetic reaction to the traumatic event, the affect, this emotional thing that's locked inside our minds, remains attached to the memory and cannot be discharged. The reaction can be discharged by an action, from tears to acts of revenge. So, something bad happens and like, as a man, or a human male from, early on, it's natural, like, want to take revenge. And that's how we can, like, have this feeling of agency and work out this, like, trauma, not necessarily trauma in, like, a psychological aspect of trauma, but something bad that happens, you want to feel as though you have agency. So it's like, a six-fingered man, right? But they said language serves as a substitute for action. By its help, an affect can be abreacted almost. So basically, it's like language. It's like just speaking about it, writing about it, can be as therapeutic as like going out and killing the six-fingered man. That wouldn't make quite for such dramatic stories as the Princess Bride. But nevertheless, it's like, again, this speaks to the power of writing, because it brings forth these things that we wouldn't necessarily be consciously aware of. Like Franz Kafka talked about, some books being the key to, I think it's unexamined rooms in our mansions or our castles. The idea being, books and writing and language can unlock these things that are inside that are causing a psychological and associated physical grief that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do anything about, because like in this society, you don't just go out and like start killing people to take revenge, and that's not healthy either, because then that creates a lot more problems. I'm not talking about prison time, I'm talking about psychological problems. But it's just really interesting, this idea of language and giving words to these thoughts and these feelings we have inside can be as therapeutic. Again, so it's like it speaks to the power of reading and the power of writing, because when we read about Hamlet or King Lear or whoever else, like whatever fictional character going through these difficulties, these psychological difficulties, struggling with like who they are and and who they might become, and and their place in the world and things like this. It's like reading about them verbalizing their struggles helps give us language to verbalize our own struggles. So it's like reading and writing are such a powerful combination, because just because you're reading about Hamlet doesn't mean you're not learning about yourself, because you can, because there are reasons this literature is great literature, because it talks about fundamental human things, like human nature has not changed and is not going to change until we change our genetic code, which might not be that far off, but probably not in our lifetimes. And so all the things that people have been struggling with for the last 10,000 years, we're struggling with. That doesn't change. And so we can learn a lot by examining their struggle. And sometimes it's even easier psychologically for us to examine their struggle, because we don't have the spotlight on us. You don't have to look at yourself and be like, wow, what a jerk I am, or like that was an awful thing to do. You can read about some fictional third person and be like, oh man, that was really bad that he did that and he got in this trouble and this is how he changed. And then later you can be like, oh yeah, maybe I can apply this to my own life. You can kind of borrow his lessons, to help yourself. Anyway, 193, the power again of reading and writing. This is interesting. Okay, so recent neuroscience research that shows that memories that are retrieved tend to return to the memory bank with modifications. As long as a memory is inaccessible, the mind is unable to change it. But as soon as a story starts being told, particularly if it is told repeatedly, it changes. The act of telling itself changes the tale. This reminds me of like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You can't observe a particle without changing, its position or velocity, momentum or whatever. You can't observe something without changing it. And the same holds true for our memories. And I mean, this is interesting in its own right, but it's very interesting from the point of view of, again, the lies we tell ourselves, where it's like, we have this story, this narrative that we've created about who we are, and who we'd like to think we are, and how we think we fit, in the world and things like this. And the more we tell ourselves these stories, and the more we remember events in our lives, the more we change the story and our memories of the events. And often we change them to better and better coincide with this like glorious, heroic image that we have of ourselves. And so, I mean, you might have done something nasty to somebody a couple of years ago, and like every time you remember it, you're going to smooth it out a little bit, right? And you're going to be not quite such a jerk the way you remember yourself being. And then, you tell yourself this story like 30 times over the course of a couple of years, and then suddenly you're like, oh man, that was like one of the best things I've ever done for somebody. I mean, that might be a little bit of an extreme, but to me, it points again to, and I realize I keep saying this over and over, but it's that important, the power, the importance of reading avidly, widely, and thoughtfully, because it's like every day, right, our minds are trying to distort our perception of reality to make us to be the heroes, okay? And that's not true. I mean, you might be the hero in your own mind, but you're probably not the hero in like anybody else's mind, because in anybody else's mind, he or she is the hero, right? And so it's like reading every day is like a way to fight back against this tendency to smooth out our memories and smooth out our perception of the world, in order to make us to be the hero. It's like a daily reminder that no, the world is going on just fine without you. There's a lot going on, and most of the people out there never heard of you and don't really care about you, even if they have heard about you. And it's like, and this is the way the world really is, because it's like when you read respected newspapers or great literature or whatever, you see things from other people's perspectives, and they don't have your perspective. You're not the hero of their lives, right? And so it's very psychologically beneficial to read all of these things, because it keeps your ego in check, it keeps your mind in check, and this natural tendency to change your memories and to change your perspective on the world. It's like, no, here's how the world actually is. It's different from the way you think the world is. And every day you remind yourself of this, and it helps. It's really psychologically beneficial. I recommend you do it. It's not always fun, but then if you make it a habit, it's like, it helps to release the stranglehold your ego has on you. Not 100%, of course, but it's like, if you're the center of your universe every minute of every day, right? It's not particularly healthy, and because your ego has such a strong stranglehold on your thoughts and your perceptions and how this filter that you have for understanding the world. So the more you read from other people's perspectives, the better it is, the more healthy it is psychologically, because you hold your ego in check and you say, okay, I get it. You think I'm the hero of the entire universe, but guess what? I'm not. So, it's a way just to be like, tell your ego, go sit down in the corner, with the dunce cap while I read this good stuff and learn about how the world actually is. Anyway. Okay, this is about traumatic memories. It's not necessarily relevant. Okay. Well, I've already talked about that. This is on like our inner understanding how we feel and things like this. Okay, and this again, I've already mentioned this. This is under a section called Writing to Yourself. There are other ways to access your inner world of feelings. One of the most effective is through writing. Most of us have poured out our hearts in angry, accusatory, plaintive, or sad letters after people have betrayed or abandoned us. I haven't read a biography on Abraham Lincoln, but I've read enough excerpts that he would often write letters to people, real nasty letters, like one of his generals did something stupid or like whatever, somebody pisses him off, he'll write a letter. And then he doesn't send it. Or he would give it to his wife to send, and she wouldn't send it. But it was like therapeutic for him just to write the letter and vent his frustrations. And then it was probably also very healthy for his relationship with these other people not to have sent it. But anyway, doing so almost always makes us feel better, even if we never send them. There you go. When you write to yourself, you don't have to worry about other people's judgment. You just listen to your own thoughts and let their flow take over. Later, when you reread what you wrote, you often discover surprising truths. This is what I said. Writing, from 4 to 6 in the morning, it's kind of like, it's dark outside. Everybody, the world is, not the world. I was going to say the world is asleep, but most of the Eastern time zone, and it's kind of like I'm in this like little cocoon. After I just woke up, I write this stuff, and later on, I'm like, oh my gosh, did I write that? I have like a stack of stuff that I've written in the last 6 months, and I'll go back and reread some of the stuff I wrote a couple months ago, and I was like, wow, I didn't know that I had that thought way back then. I thought this is just a thought that I had recently. But anyway, again, this speaks to the power of writing to understand, to understand what you're really thinking and what you're really feeling, because psychologically it's very healthy. It's like the farther you can get away from telling yourself lies about who you think you are, how you think you feel, how you would like to think you feel, whatever, the better. It's like an honest and realistic assessment of who you are and your place in the world and how the world really is. Helps us navigate life in like so much better and in such a healthier way, considering we are social creatures, so we have to operate within the context of a society. This is the last one. Okay, it just talks about how they've done studies and they found that writing improves physical and mental health. So kind of more of the same. So it's I've been talking for a very long time. I'm surprised if anybody's actually watching this far. This is a very interesting book in its own right, just to understand human psychology, particularly the role of the subconscious, the role of our memories, how our minds and our bodies interact, how some of these particularly strong, and in this case, traumatic memories get encoded into our bodies and our physiological responses. But for me, this was particularly interesting, just thinking about psychology and as it, like human psychology, and as it relates to discovering one's passion, and why some of these tools, in particular reading and writing, can be so effective. Not just for potentially discovering one's passion, but for living a psychologically and healthy and physically and socially healthy life. So anyway, this is a long book. I found it very useful. It would take, if you have normal daily commitments, it would take you a while to get through. It can be quite technical. I recommend, check it out from the library and read a couple chapters and see if it's interesting to you or not. But this is what I got out of it, specifically for what I thought was valuable to share with you about discovering your passion. So I guess that's it for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.